all know, like Priya just mentioned, that IPTSE is an initiative to promote IP awareness. And today's session is one such in this entire awareness program. And in these testing times, we believe that it is imperative to have a dialogue, especially something which is more balanced in nature, because we know that there are lots of rounds going on. There are differences in opinion with regard to what the current pandemic and the IP waivers, etc. So we thought it prudent to at least invite, all relevant people here today. And therefore, we have assembled in this panel of experts to consolidate views of experienced and young practitioners at the Common Forum. On this note, let me just give a very quick introduction to our panelists. I know we've got, almost less than now 60 minutes, close to that, being mindful of that. And we've got several questions to ask the panelists. Let me quickly introduce the lady first, Archana Shankar. She's a partner at Anand Anand. And Mr. KG Ananthakrishnan, he is the Director General, OPPI. Professor Unnat Pandit, Dean, and also he leads the entrepreneurship cell and the management school at JNU. Dr. Yogesh Pai, he is a faculty and co-director at CIIP NLU Delhi. Mr. Manu Chaturvedi, advocate and Fulbright scholar, and Mr. Raman Sena, IP counsel at Robert Bosch. So welcome you all. Very happy to see you. There are lots of questions. I'll start with first question, and this question is primarily to Dr. Unnat, KG Ananthakrishnan, and Yogesh. And then we pick up the next question, and we have next three eminent panelists to talk about it. So my first question to you is, what are your views on proposed TRIPS waiver for, let's say, COVID-related IP at WTO being led by India and South Africa? And would this practically boost any production? May I invite Dr. Unnat first?
Yeah, Namaskar. See, first of all, we need to understand that what kind of a waiver is recommended. It's under the TRIPS, all the members have to implement and apply the Section 1 waiver, or 4 or 5 or 7, which is a part 2 of a TRIPS. And the another one is a part 3 of the TRIPS, which is essentially for the healthcare product or technologies, which includes the diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, or medical devices and like. And that is essentially for supporting the management of a COVID and preventing and treating the COVID patients. So the aspect which has been recommended has a noble cause and is going to help the humanity to combat with the COVID-19 situation. So this is where the objective behind asking for the waiver is undoubtedly that they want to save the humanity, they want to save the people from infected with the COVID. Now, the second question arises how this is going to get implemented and what is going to be the implications of this. Is it going to be restricted towards the COVID-19 only or beyond this also? So that's where the entire debate or discussion is. We certainly need to safeguard the humanity from the COVID, and I firmly believe that it should not have any implication of a post-COVID or a post-pandemic effect. So certainly it should be limited to the pandemic situation and its management only. So with this, again, throughout this 1 hour discussion, we are going to interact. So we'll share some of my views also. Over to you, Sheetal.
Thank you, Dr. Unnat. I think very well said. I mean, this is pandemic, extreme emergency, and this is unprecedented times. And as you rightly always say, that balance is what we all need. Let me quickly go to KG Ananthakrishnan. KG, what are your views? You come from industry. What views do you share? And you are the ones who bring the medicines to the world, right? Your companies. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Sheetal. Thanks to PTSE for organizing this webinar. I mean, and also the distinguished members of the panel who have enormous experience from a IP point of view. You know, I do agree with what Professor said a little while ago. You know, this pandemic has challenged the nations across the globe, not just only India. And in our opinion, patent waiver for vaccines and therapeutics may not be a solution to a rather complex situation. And I'm going to take a couple of minutes to just share my thoughts there. What do I mean by that? See, if you look at the biopharmaceutical industry, the entire edifice on which this industry has been built is on innovation, on collaboration, both at national and international level, and ensuring how best, whether it is vaccines or drugs and related products, are made available to challenge, to tackle this challenge in a very effective, manner. Look at what happened, as you rightly mentioned, Sheetal. Biopharmaceutical manufacturers were fully committed, and within the shortest possible time, with all this collaboration, have been able to get a vaccine as well as several other drugs for the management of COVID. Normally, a drug comes into the market, almost it takes about 10 to 15 years. Here, a vaccine came within about 350 days time frame. That's the type of intensity with which this industry has worked in collaboration with academia, with other partners, with government, global agencies to ensure that we have a good vaccine and therapies. After more than 200 clinical trials with nearly 300 partnerships and collaborations amongst manufacturers worldwide, the production has increased. Just about a few months back, it was zero. And somewhere in the end of May, we were talking about 2.5 billion doses being manufactured of vaccine. And by the end of this year, we are expecting around 11 billion doses to be manufactured right across the globe. So IP is not barrier, for either a vaccine or a medicine access. Instead, facilitating partners to work together, share technology, voluntary licensing, founded on the security provided by IP protection, is what has enabled the unprecedented number of voluntary collaborations between innovative vaccine and drug manufacturers as well as expert manufacturing partners. This has happened, and we are all, aware of it. So in our opinion, long-standing intellectual property protection are critical to our efforts to develop and manufacture vaccine, and at the same time ensure that the public good is also kept in mind, as a professor mentioned a little earlier. We are not very sure whether waiving the patent will necessarily address this particular problem. Why do I say this? Because our worry is that if we do that, it risks redirecting critical medical supplies, including scarce raw material for vaccines, as well as other drugs, to unproven firms globally, and could jeopardize actually the existing vaccine manufacturing ability to meet the current and future needs across the globe, including India. We are also not very sure, by just waiving of this, what's the type of risk to global health, because if substandard vaccines are manufactured, it could in fact have a damaging effect. I'm not just talking about India, because when we are talking about this patent waiver, we are talking about patent waiver across the world. And hence, this must be kept in mind.
Got it, KG.
The process of manufacturing safe and effective on a global scale is very challenging. And I will just complete. Give me just about a minute more. Why do I say this? See, each COVID vaccine is highly specialized, whether it is an mRNA-based technology or a virus-based technology or a bacteria-based technology. Every one is extremely complex. It needs highly trained personnel, experienced personnel to supervise and ensure that we are having the right quality vaccine available to the people at large. Given this, the way currently the mechanism is operating in terms of collaboration, working together, addressing the problem by, identifying what the issue is probably the solution. We have seen that. We have, partnership between AstraZeneca and Serum Institute in India, J&J and BioE, the two vaccine stuff, and many more probably are going to follow through. And look at the drug space. Almost every single drug that has been identified for the treatment of COVID, whether it is remdesivir, you have 7 voluntary licenses given in India. Baricitinib, 5 or 6 licenses are given in India. So you look at Molio, the new drug from MSD, they have given 5 licenses. So we need to look at the problem and what is the solution that we are looking for it. We want to save lives. We want to protect people. We want to ensure medicines, diagnostics, vaccines are available to them. Let us look at the larger complex issue of addressing it rather than just looking at some short-term solution. This needs collective, collaborative effort, and that is what is going to help save us in India as well as save the patients across the globe.
Got it. Yeah, thanks, KG. I think very relevant points. Also, being myself from the pharma industry, I know that the statistics are scientifically proven that close to 23% of the total turnover from pharma is actually invested in R&D. So from that perspective, what you say makes a lot of sense. In fact, it's not only current pandemic, but a lot of waves expected to come. So we need to be ready for that. But thank you so much, KG. We'll come back to you. And now I think it's very important to also have an academic viewpoint. I know, Yogesh, you've been doing extensive research. A lot of newspaper articles are already out under your authorship. Can you please enlighten with your views on this question?
Yeah. Thanks, Sheetal, and thanks IPTSE for having me here. It's always a great opportunity to be with esteemed panelists and in front of your audience to present our views. We have done some collaborative work with Prashant Reddy. Both of us are of the view, and at least speaking for myself, it's not a moral opposition that we have to the waiver proposal. Our opposition has largely been on utilitarian and practical concerns, and I'll explain it to you why. When you talk about waiver of TRIPS obligations means countries who are part of the waiver get an opportunity not to implement the WTO IP obligations. So when you say you don't implement patents and when you don't implement or enforce trade secrets, it practically means that in your domestic territory, you are not required to enforce if somebody infringes on them, right? And which means also that you don't need to provide compensation. Now, as far as patents are concerned, patents largely pose legal barriers and not structural barriers, because even if there are patents, there are many at-risk launches in the market, which means basically if somebody wants to copy patented technology, they can still copy and go to the market, and then it's upon the court either to grant an injunction or not to grant an injunction and award damages. That is ongoing royalties. And we have seen it in India in many cases that such ongoing royalties have been provided for patent infringement cases by allowing the infringer to continue infringement for the sake of access. So that jurisprudence is already clear to us in India. So patents largely pose legal barriers and not structural barriers. Now, coming to trade secret protection, particularly in relation to vaccines and most other biological products are not easy to copy. So you need active collaboration from the originator firms in terms of not only their regulatory dossiers, etc., but also the manufacturing know-how. So if you say that you're going to waive trade secrets in India, what does it mean ultimately? Unless US also agrees to sort of push their domestic firms to do tech transfer in India. Now this question was raised to the ambassador of India in Geneva a month back when HAI Health International Third World Network, they organized a big conference, and the ambassador was directly asked one question. How do you take care of this situation where you don't have a technology that has already been transferred to your country? So how are you going to expect that the US government is in pursuance of the waiver is going to do that? Because waiver means basically you get not to implement the provisions, but it does not mean other countries should also, push their firms to, do the tech transfer. His simple answer was, look, we already have some amount of technology transfer in the form of brownfield investments. Now, if you consider brownfield investments, currently mRNA are not brownfield investments. mRNA technologies are still not transferred to us. So basically, if the waiver immediately comes to force, then you still don't have access to mRNA technologies. Now, the other argument is, oh, in mRNA, we just need regulatory dossiers. We don't need their know-how because mRNA technologies are relatively easier to make. I don't know. But even if that is the concern, regulatory dossiers can be made public under Article 39.3 of the TRIPS agreement. So I don't really understand, if the waiver gets implemented, how is it that you're going to have access to new technologies, that existing technologies, that have been transferred to Serum, that have been transferred to other companies, can be forced perhaps under the waiver. India can force those companies to, disclose it to other companies and ramp up production, if that is the solution that you see to ramping up production. Otherwise, in terms of, new technologies, the waiver is going to disincentivize tech transfer for the years to come. And this pandemic, if it is going to last because of new mutations, new technologies are not going to be accessible under the waiver. The reason being, unless they force it, that's not going to happen. And there is very little chance that, Western administrations are going to take a real political challenge of, pushing their companies to force technology transfer to Indian firms. Thank you.
Got it. Yeah, very relevant points, Yogesh. And also I've read through, your piece, as I said, in other forums also. Just for the panelists, I just wanted to tell you that there are lots of people right now watching, all of you. So it's more than 140 above. And I would definitely want to thank AIPR Acropolis Institute for Pharmacy. I know I'm doing this thanks again because I can see excitement from faculties and the students out there. I know yesterday when I was speaking with Dr. Rakhi Kabia, professor at Acropolis, and she also asked that, students today are not just interested in studying their, books, but also want to learn from all of you, and therefore they are all there. So thanks to Principal Saab and also Professor Rakhi. Okay, my next question, and I would now invite the rest three set of panelists. And the question is, you've heard about from the previous three panelists, they talk about balance, they talk about right to health, but they also talk about that there shouldn't be chilling of innovation. So the question is, how do you think that the right to health, which is guaranteed under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, can be balanced with the need to accelerate innovation to stay ahead of other pandemics in future? I would like to first invite Manu. Would you like to go ahead?
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here, IPTSE, and thank you, Peter, and to all the other esteemed panelists. I would just like to preface this by saying that I am not an IP practitioner, but have been following and variously involved in proceedings before the Delhi High Court concerning the second wave of the pandemic. And obviously, we've all been following what's happening in the Supreme Court. Just a few reflections before we get into that, because I think it has some bearing on the present discussion. And I think the discussion can also go further in these terms, because a lot of the times, for instance, I don't fully understand the technicalities that underlie vaccine production and, whether in what instances do we need not just IP patent waivers, but also allied sort of waivers and access to trade secrets, so on and so forth. But I think that a lot of the times what happens is we argue from the extremities. So I think Yogesh did a good job of, making that distinction clear that there are certain vaccines like the mRNA vaccines where the challenges, even after a compulsory license scheme is implemented, would be so immense and so large that it would render the whole process sort of dysfunctional or nugatory, right? But for instance, in cases moving away from the TRIPS and coming to India, and what the Supreme Court has been asking, has in fact on two occasions asked the government of India, is what are we doing with vaccines, homegrown vaccines like the Covaxin, right? So variously, for instance, submissions have been made before the court, and I have been reading up on it, this is obviously subject to correction because I'm not a scientific expert. But for instance, these processes are not very different in the case of Covaxin, at least, from the processes that are implemented for the production of the cholera vaccine. So there's not much outside of the patent waiver that we need to look at in terms of vaccines like Covaxins, which are indigenously developed. And let's not forget, I mean, partially the whole process is, the ICMR has been an equal partner in all of this and is getting royalties. So before we look at TRIPS, and of course we can look at both of these things simultaneously. The question that is falling from the court, which is extremely important, and that people like me would also be interested in being answered by the panel, is why aren't we looking at compulsory license for Covaxin? Now, I was reading somewhere that I think instead of going down the route of compulsory licensing, which would be a general blanket regulatory decision that would have to be taken, what they're doing is they're going and approaching various companies. So I think, and again, subject to correction, there is another, I forget the name of the company. I think it's Hafkin. I've written it down somewhere. So the government has asked Hafkin to look into production of Covaxin. So there are, of course, many ways to push this further, but the court has obviously been asking for data. And similarly, we have also been asking for data, to look at data as to what process would be better. Would you need to balance public health interests to the right to health interests of your citizens at large? First, you need to assess how many vaccines truly are we projected to acquire, procure, and produce? By what time do we see the double dosage, the first round of vaccinations, to be complete for a majority of the citizens, so at least that critical mass can be achieved in terms of vaccination? So none of that data is really forthcoming right now in terms of what the governments are willing to share, even in courts. In fact, as late as yesterday, or maybe a couple of days ago, I'm forgetting, but there was this whole, not really a fracas, but this sort of dramatized scenario in court where the court, I've never seen something like this, where the court is basically pleading, the government that, look, we're not going to encroach on policy issues. You can take these policy issues. We recognize compulsory licensing is mostly in the realm of regulatory policy. You get to take these decisions, but at least share the data with us. Share it with the experts outside of the ICMR, set up all these monitoring committees, and they ask them for a comprehensive policy document. And that policy document is yet to be shared. And actually, one wonders if there is a comprehensive policy document. So usually what you'll get in return from the government is stuff like, these are dynamic, appraisals. We have to keep changing, what our policy suggestions are, what our policy parameters are, and therefore, unsaid, but therefore we don't have a comprehensive policy document. So firstly, from a public health point of view, there is very little data going around that people like me, honestly, and even courts can look at and say, okay, these are actually the concerns that mediate compulsory licensing vis-a-vis public health concerns, and this is the time schedule we are looking at. So right now, the court is obviously seized of the matter in such a manner where it's trying to extricate data. And what it's doing, and my sense is what it will continue to do, is, so it's passed two judgments effectively. Of course, there have been a series of orders, but it has passed two judgments. One was, I think, on the 30th of April, and the other was just a few days ago at the close of May. And in both instances, what the courts are doing, I think, is laying the groundwork for saying, look, we are in tacit. It's sort of like judicial politics more than anything else, right? The court is leveraging its own institutional strength to sort of put its weight behind whatever the government needs to do. So, I mean, to basically cut to the chase, what the courts have been saying is, looked at it from any which way, from the point of view of price discrimination, or whole sections of the population being priced out of vaccinations because of, for whatever reason, whatever are the costs of vaccines, be it the nature of procurement, the center and the state, procurement policies that are in place. The court has been saying in each of these instances, and all of this ties to public health eventually, because the court has been saying, look, prima facie, which is obviously not a firm and conclusive view, prima facie, we're of the view that all of these aspects of your vaccination policy as they currently stand are arbitrary and irrational. And of course, they have to then embark on this whole inquiry as to whether they are in fact and indeed arbitrary and irrational. But those are the signals that a court is sending out. And what else can the court do at this instance without enough data, that it can peruse and analyze? So it has been sending out these signals, and it has been saying, in fact, if you look at the judgment of May, it's not a very long section, but there is a section that is dedicated to a discussion around compulsory licensing, right? So it's sort of window dressing, the judgment and saying, look, there is also the scheme of compulsory licensing. Why don't you think about going down that route? principally because the concerns remain the same. Now, I think Sir had right now pointed out that we are looking at 11 billion doses. I might be completely wrong again. But even if it's 11 billion doses, I'm extrapolating from the 3 billion that used to be the figure maybe 2-3 weeks ago. I don't know if that figure still conserves, but elsewhere I was, looking at some other literature, and it said what we are likely to get is about 3 billion doses out in the global supply chain, right? And basically looking at something around 20 to 30% of the entire population being fully vaccinated in the world. And this is in context of the fact that most of the vaccines that are being produced in these developed nations, 80 to 90% of that supply has already been cornered by these developed nations, so it's not coming to us. And 40 to 45% of the global production also is being cornered by between 15 to 20% of these developed countries, where 15 to 20% of the global population resides. So it is in that context we have to see all of this, right? So public health concerns in India are, have to speak to all of these ground realities, all of which the government does not seem to be taking a stand on, right? And it may be the case that the government itself is not in a position to really put on affidavit some of this stuff, but it can put it down as projection. It can provide a comprehensive policy. And in the end, it will be the government which has to take this decision of compulsory licensing, or you can, any of these midterm arrangements like voluntary licensing, using the threat of CL to leverage licenses. So it has to be the government's prerogative. I don't think it's going to come from the court. It should have been at the top of the government's agenda, not just in relation to vaccine. I'll just end with this, not just with respect to vaccines, but also with respect to drugs like, remdesivir is now, let's not get into remdesivir discussions, but tocilizumab and, all these other drugs. We are seeing countries like Hungary and Russia, if I'm not wrong, which have issued CLs on remdesivir. So it's not without precedent. And the government should have been thinking about this comprehensively 7-8 months ago. It is not for the courts to step in, although the courts have waded in quite responsibly, I feel, into the whole debate of public health. But I think it has to be the government's decision. It should have been taken a long time ago. And as for these presenting all of these things as fait accompli, which is, there are all these concerns with respect to allied technologies, trade secrets, etc. I think we can parse that debate further. We can look at it in a more granular manner and look at maybe the vaccines which are available. For instance, Sputnik 5 is contracted, if I'm not wrong, is in discussions with 4 or 5 manufacturers in India to manufacture. Right? So where is all that technology coming from? So we can differentiate amongst various vaccines, and thankful to Yogeshji that he had at least adverted to that. So I think we can take a look at that, but it has to be the government's call. I think the courts will uphold whatever decisions they take, in furtherance of licensing or whatever.
Got it. Thanks, Manu. I think all of you are so passionate. Looks like a lot of research has actually come out. I know, Dr. Unnat, you also want to present your views, but allow me to just quickly finalize the second question with Archana and Aman's views, and then we'll do a quick round for reflections from all of you. Archana, go ahead.
Thanks, Sheetal, and a very good morning to everyone. I kind of endorse everybody's view, at least the ones who the panelists who have spoken about this. But, just to take a step back, when you look at the we've always seen India as being more, it's not a research-based institute, what we see in India. And what has eventually happened is that COVID, maybe for whatever reason, COVID has actually propelled indigenous research, particularly in complex technologies like vaccine production, which was very, very rare. And it was always the ball game of what we saw as multinationals doing something of that kind. Now, the question that certainly arises with, Article 21 and the right to health and the state obligations for providing public health is the question that you already posed is that does it all end with the pandemic? Now, research obviously does not end with pandemic. And what is the solution? Is the solution granting compulsory license? Is the solution, doing IP waivers? Maybe, maybe not. But at least, from the ground reality, what we see from the government, one is obviously, we're all aware that the Niti Aayog, Dr. V.K. Paul just recently came out, I think it was last week or maybe a week before that, came out with a statement that India is not planning to issue compulsory license for COVID-19 vaccines, right or wrong. I'm not going into that discussion of, whether he ought to have given such a statement, because it's obviously, the discretion of the central government or the patent office and things of that kind, looking at the facts of the particular case. But it is something which kind of came from the government, a representation from the government, that they might have just recognized that CL is not the path for getting public health or providing vaccines to the Indian population. And then recently, you have two sides of it. One is obviously the government, and the other side is, let's take Serum Institute, which as of now is the largest manufacturer of the Covishield vaccine that we have in India and largest supplier. Mr. Poonawalla went out and made a statement that I think it was early this year in February, when he was really being pushed to scale up the vaccine production by the government. He kind of came up with a statement that he does not agree that patent, IP, in particular patents, is a bottleneck to, for vaccine manufacturing or to provide access to medical health. The issue the challenges that they really faced was scaling up. And when you talk of scaling up IP, particularly in COVID, are we only talking of COVID vaccines? Are we talking of, paramedics? Are we talking of, diagnostic? Are we talking of repurposed drugs? I think the issue is, and I would kind of confine myself just to vaccines, given the fact that vaccines indeed are, they're kind of wrapped up in a lot of IP layers. It's not just that, you do an IP waiver or a patent waiver and, you will just get the production. It's just kind of, even if you do a compulsory license or do an IP waiver, it really doesn't help. We, as of now, have 300 collaborations. And if you kind of read the WIPO research that has just recently, it's a WIPO or a WTO research, they've come out that with these 300 partnerships across the globe, they can actually vaccinate the entire population of the world in the next 3 months. So the right to health is not, IP is one part of it, but at the same time, are we going to apply this IP waiver only to the COVID? Because we have to continue research. We have to keep innovating. We have to keep protecting these innovations. And we need to continue research with maybe to conditions that may be very, very unique to India, like countries like the least developed countries. You may not have larger companies investing in India for conditions that are very, very unique to India. So taking just as, I think what the balance has to be, a commercial risk versus the performance risk, where there is a continuing research that is happening. There is variants that are coming out and the demand is mitigated. You have to mitigate the demand by financial protection, government support, public subsidies, maybe IP coverage and regulatory certainty. And obviously, you'll have to look at all the three arms of this entire, the public health that we are talking of. And the three arms are the Indian pharmaceutical companies. And I'm not calling them generic because we've got a large number of these Indian companies as well who have the know-how to. They've been doing indigenous research. You have policymakers who have to ensure that innovations are available at affordable prices and accessible. And then you have to have that impetus for innovator companies to innovate and solve these healthcare needs, which keep arising from time to time. So it's all a collective effort that has to kind of be taken together. It's a bundle of associations and a bundle of IP rights that have to be collectively dealt with in order to address the public health need that we're talking about under Article 21. And the approach cannot be a myopic one. We've been seeing, we've seen ground reality, and Manu spoke about the ground reality. We've got people around you, and when it starts happening to people around you, you see, you've got Covaxin already. It's an indigenous manufactured vaccine, but there are no vaccines today available for the second shot. So that's the reason why Supreme Court and High Court had to actually step in to say, hey guys, what are you doing? Why can you not just scale up your manufacturing capacity today? But the response of the government and even for these manufacturing companies is that it's not easy scaling up vaccine production because it is an extremely complex technology. It's technology transfer, it's the mRNA, it's about the way you deliver the vaccine, the storage conditions, the distribution, and price. According to me, if we look at the price, government can always control the price. And if we look at the price all over the world, I think all over the world, the prices have been controlled for all these COVID-related COVID-related therapies. Just the last point that maybe I would like to say that we are talking about, global partnerships and voluntary licenses, where we have been, there have been partnerships of Gilead, there have been partnerships of baricitinib, but there has to be a kind of, checks and balances when we are looking at these voluntary licenses. Are they only limited for the COVID pandemic? Because originally these drugs were not approved for treatment of hospitalized patients for COVID. They are only patented, but repurposed. There's a kind of second medical condition. So are you going to be allowing companies to flood the Indian market post-COVID pandemic so that the entire IP generated on that molecule or the vaccine becomes so redundant that it's very difficult to withdraw products from the market if they go for non-COVID use as well?
Yeah. Thanks, Archana. I think hearing all of you, and Aman, next is your turn. But I think each one of you, when we hear you, it looks like you all have reasons to say why you say what you're saying right now. Otherwise, people might think it's a divergence of brain, but one common thing that I can feel coming from all of you, that it's a public concern, whether by way of continuing with the innovation cycle or keeping any price check. I think ultimate aim is one. So I'm very happy that we all carry the same aim of public health and the importance there. Aman, over to you, please.
Yeah, I see that you have made this question into quite a constitutional question. So although I am not a constitutional law expert, but given that I was in law school not so long ago, so I would like to express that, see, like when we are talking about the right to health, so once now the right has been established. Now, once a right is established, it automatically correlates a duty for another to so that it can be enforced, so that it can be used. In fact, in one of the Supreme Court judgments, if I recall, they said that no doubt that the government is making all the facilities, all the plans, the hospitals, the drugs to their to whatever extent they are able to, but in order for this right to be meaningful, it has to reach all the people as far as possible. In the COVID situation, I think we all as well as government and the state needs to acknowledge that there has been some efforts that were lacking, due to which we have, according to official records, we have lost some 344,000 people from our nation. So this is one thing that I wanted to say about the right to health. Now, the point of it being balanced with the commercial interests or intellectual property, well, from my understanding, you have to also look at it from the point of view that because you are researching, you are innovating, you are developing intellectual property, that also is a means to protect right to health and right to life, so that you are continuously researching so that you can develop vaccines, drugs, all the requirements for any future diseases, pandemics that may occur. In fact, I think in one of your channel's videos only, it was mentioned that the mRNA technology has been in development since the 1990s. So it is not that something that it has just come up now and very few people have access to it. In fact, so I checked up the patents that were listed by Moderna on their website as to what all patents they are having. So I saw that there are only 2 of them which are having Indian families at all, and both of them have not been granted. So you cannot say that patents are what is holding it back. At the same time, we must recognize that some of these instruments, like I think some of the panelists mentioned baricitinib, which is actually a rheumatoid arthritis drug that is being repurposed to COVID. For that, an Indian generic did apply for a compulsory license, although it did not need to be considered because the license holder gave the license to a plethora of Indian players. But what we need to ensure is that these provisions are also, like compulsory licensing is also there in order to ensure that the right to health and primarily the right to life is able to be enforced. So these have to go hand in hand. It's not that IP is one and compulsory license is not part of it. We have to, as in the legal construction, I think it is called harmoniously, we have to construe these two. So all of these are essentially balancing out the interests. There is one major issue that I felt though, when we were talking about what all has been happening in the courts. I think there was one case that was going on in the Bombay High Court where there was a plea that the people are running after foreign-made drugs like tocilizumab and all that. There are better Indian alternatives available. I think at the same time, we need to ensure that the state also has to see that people are suffering out there. I think Manu is very active on Instagram and he has been helping a lot of people. So there are a lot of people who are having issues. So to sum up, basically, I would have to say that IP has to keep on going, but you have to balance it with the right to health, because and in any case, if you are not going to be saving the people, then you are going to be losing out on the public perception and the image. If you are not going to be having that goodwill, then as it is, the people will not be having faith in the particular organization or company. So this is my submission on this issue.
Thank you so much, Aman. Very relevant points again. I'm very mindful of the fact that we are at sharp 11:45. We have had chance to do 2 questions. Now, let's open up the floor to see the reflections, Dr. Unnat, with you, and then we go around the table.
Maybe I would like to give a views after a couple of minutes after hearing Mr. KG. He has also raised the hand.
All right. Yeah, KG, go ahead.
Sheetal, it is very nice to see that we are now discussing the constitutional provision of right to health. And that is happening during a pandemic like COVID. I think right to health was a fundamental right even before COVID, am I right? It's a fundamental right. And it is so important that the government and all stakeholders realize that we invest in health and healthcare infrastructure. And this is what the healthcare industry has been, advocating all through. We cannot have a robust healthcare infrastructure investing around 1% of the GDP. We need to have a solid investment. At least, the stated 2 to 2.5% that is being talked about, if that comes, then basic infrastructure will be there. You know what? Getting even best of the medicines will not have any effect if we do not have the infrastructure to administer it, right? The technical manpower to adjust it. So it is very important that we first invest in healthcare, and particularly the healthcare infrastructure. That is one point. The second is what this, pandemic has also taught us, and I think it was alluded to well by Archana, is innovation. Because if you look at, countries that are way ahead, what differentiated them was the power of innovation. Because the power of innovation helped them bring the drugs, the vaccines, the technologies, what have you, to start addressing the problem in a much more aggressive manner and early enough. I think both investment in infrastructure for healthcare and also creating a conducive environment which recognizes, rewards, facilitates innovation is what is going to take our country to a different platform from where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, KG. Dr. Unnat, you want to come in now, or you want to hear Archana, Manu, and Aman, however you wish, and Yogesh?
This is just because I would like to give a global perspective. And we have to learn from the mistakes which has happened earlier. I would like to quote here the HIV example for African countries. more than 36 million people were infected. And out of that, just 1 million people were having access to the drug. And with the WHO intervention and subsidizing the drug rate, still 50% of the patients are having the access to the medicine. And no waiver were granted for HIV. So we need to think the IP waiver from providing the access to the access of medicine to the patient. And that's the primary concern. More than 5 lakh deaths happened in 2020 just because there was no access to the HIV medicine. Do we want such situation arising out of a COVID also? And that's why government has intervened to have the IP waiver for the COVID medicine, vaccine, and the other diagnostic and therapeutic treatment. That's most important. It's not about India or in Africa or US or Russia or any other country. India is taking this stand for the humanity. And so many students and faculties are watching this. So I would like to make it clear that government has made the policy intervention. Compulsory license is not a solution. Compulsory license provision is with India, but may not be applicable outside India, or so many countries will not have such a provision. So what will happen there? So it's not a right remedy. Every time policy intervention has been taken, and I firmly support the Niti Aayog statement that why compulsory license is not a single solution. Secondly, giving the access to this medicine and or a vaccine is requiring a timely intervention. This is the right time when, with the government intervention and with the WTO and TRIPS waiver, we want to make this access available to the needy people. Out of the vaccine which are made available, less than 1 or 2% vaccine is available in African countries. Government has initially tried to arrange all those vaccines and supplied these vaccines to more than 48 countries when we were not having a second wave. In second wave, except the 15-20 days, government has managed the entire situation. It's a duty hand in hand working on managing the pandemic situation. Nobody can predict. Nobody in the world has a prediction what is going to happen in the third wave. So government is trying to make it accessible, available, all the infrastructure, all the facility, all the therapeutic treatment, all the vaccine access to the people. And that's what is important in the time to face the COVID pandemic situation. Before December 2020, nobody would have imagined that one such small virus is going to destroy the entire global economy. And we can see what is happening. So this is not a typical case of a patent waiver or typical case of a compulsory licensing, which has been dealt in India or outside India or outside the any other country. Primary focus is making the accessibility, arranging the vaccines, which is most promising at this point in time. If India need to vaccinate 100% population at the current infrastructure, current facility, enhancing by certain percentage, even though 2.5 years is going to take.
Got it.
And more than 1 lakh crore Government has to support. Do the Indian economy can afford this? What is going to happen with the African country who doesn't have such a monetary or access of a healthcare or pharma infrastructure?
Yeah.
We are thinking at a large. Indian government has thought this. It has been supported by so many countries. And that's the beauty, that we are not just thinking for India or making the medicine vaccines available for Indian. We are thinking
For the
for
globe.
the humanity at a large. And
Got it.
in this perspective, we have taken up this stand at the WTO.
Thank you so much, Dr. Unnat. I think you make very valid points. And while people were hearing you, they also posted a question. And I'll request others to also come in and intervene. Archana, you are the next. And then Yogesh, Manu, and Aman also. So there is a question that if there is so much that government is trying to do in order to ensure that there are capabilities, manufacturing capabilities by other companies, what is stopping? I mean, IP may be a legal hurdle, let's say hypothetically, to private manufacturers, but what is stopping government to utilize its own factories and other facilities to come up with the patented vaccines? Because there is Section 100, Section 66, and other relevant sections in the Parent Act, which doesn't stop government to do for the benefit of country. But I'll request Archana to go ahead and quickly. I think we have only 5 minutes, so quick comments will be great by all of you. Archana, go ahead.
Thanks, Sheetal. I'll kind of just maybe summarize my views in 1 or 2 minutes. One is scaling up production. The second is looking at your demographic situation in the country. How many people, what is the kind of population that you are looking at vaccinating? And I'll give you an example, like maybe 10 days ago, I took a large number of people in, for vaccination, like my domestic help and people in my complex, the security guards for vaccination after you register on COVID app. And while I was waiting for them to get vaccinated, I started talking to a fruit vendor there, to which I asked that, "Aap kyun nahi vaccine laga rahe? Sarkar to free laga rahi hai vaccine. Aap ekdam school ke bahar khade." To which his answer was that, you know what, in Bihar, there are many people who have died because of the vaccine. So I don't intend to get myself or my family vaccinated. So the question, there's multiple questions and issues that are involved. A, look at your demographic. B, vaccine hesitancy awareness. And I think recently there was a village in Maharashtra where the panchayat, the Gram Panchayat lady, the head, went about, educating people in her village to be COVID free, and the reason. That's the kind of planning that the government needs to do. The COVID app, that's a huge digital divide. How many people have smartphones? Even if you have smartphones, how many of that population is literate? People can't even write and read in our country. And we are talking about a COVID app. You go to any jurisdiction, any country globally, all you need to show is that, are you vaccinated, not vaccinated? They'll put a jab and you make that record, whether it's an Indian, whether it's a foreigner, anybody living in the country. So what is this Aadhaar card? So can you not have somebody who is not, an NRI, who doesn't have an Aadhaar card, who doesn't live in the country, vaccinated India? You talk about healthcare systems. We talk about voluntary license. Baricitinib, 8 voluntary licenses, no profit for COVID. We've got the Gilead example. We've got excessive production. So it has to be the outreach. It has to be a very, very good planning of your entire healthcare system. And one part of it is IP. I'm not saying that IP is not a part of it, but all of this collectively, you can't ignore the population. Who are you? Which population are you dealing with? Even if you have billions and billions of vaccines sitting in your production house, will you be able to get that to the villages where they don't have storage facility? Why could we not get the Pfizer vaccine in India? One is obviously the indemnification that we've been talking about. But did we have the capacity to store it at minus 70 degrees or something of that kind? No, we did not have that capacity. So there are large number of factors that have to be looked into when we are talking of public health.
Got it. Thank you so much, Archana, for being crisp. Yogesh, there is a very important question in the live chat, and I am tempted to pick that up for you and Manu and Aman. Quick responses. This is from Dr. G.N. Davekar, as I mentioned, he's from the Acropolis Pharmaceutical Education and Research. So Principal Saab is asking, providing compulsory licensing or waiver without investment by government agencies, will it not lead to discourage the innovators, as IP is the main driving force to recover the investments?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Let me first answer what has been said. See, one of the problems with compulsory licenses are granted based on the ability of some other pharmaceutical company to have the existing capacity to produce. Now, in relation to remdesivir, the problem was that even if you grant a compulsory license, there are already 7 licensees with 20 manufacturing plants, and you can't anticipate future demand. The reason why remdesivir was not produced the mass scale, because between December and March, there was a lull in demand because there was practically no COVID. And because of that, the manufacturing was scaled down. And once you ramped up manufacturing by these 20 plants, and now I think it has been extended to some 50 more plants, you had huge production. So compulsory license, even I don't know if anybody would have been even interested to take it up in case of remdesivir. So it's a case-by-case analysis, and I will leave it there. On the question of innovation incentives, I think it's very clear. If you need the private sector to innovate, not in terms of early stage R&D that usually public sector R&D does in terms of universities and other institutes, but in terms of commercialization and taking it from the lab to the market, there is a huge risk involved. So naturally, you'll have to incentivize the private sector. Private sector relies on intellectual property. There is no other magic bullet, unless, for example, one way is if the government grants, say, for example, 100 crore rupees to a private firm, it should be on the guarantee that they are going to have a non-exclusive kind of licensing provided the product comes into the market. So there are huge, early ex-ante incentives questions that have to be resolved, if not for intellectual property, to some other methods. And those methods have permanent cycles of either overcompensation or undercompensation. So if you ask a standard economist, that would be the reasonable answer for incentives. So I think the government of India needs to take a step back, evaluate on its statements it has made in India, the current situation in India, where supply is saying that please don't impose price controls on us because we are getting the mRNA technology to the country, and then at the same time asking for a waiver, at the WTO, which, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, is not a workable solution. And the workable solution perhaps is to sit across the table and negotiate for discriminatory pricing for low and middle income countries. And this should have been our strategy right from day one. We missed 6 crucial months prior to making the waiver proposal and ended up in the situation today where it's either or kind of situation rather than a way where solutions can be worked out. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yogesh. I hope Dr. Davekar, G.N. Davekar, you got the response, but I will take the liberty to take a couple of more minutes because I'm yet to hear Manu and Amal, and then we close. Allow me that. Manu, please go ahead. Your reflections or any other, or maybe your response to Principal's question. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish this has gone on longer because I'm learning more than the past 10 days of research have yielded. So to be very honest with everyone. No, I'll just sort of, in terms of reflections, I'll just sort of reiterate and also try to encompass some of the points that have been raised, especially the last question, right? So I think a couple of things should be clear, right? As Sir KG Sir was saying that, of course, right to health has been around for a very long time. So it's not a novel discussion that we're having around the right to health. The second is the case for exceptionalism in the current circumstance. I think we can all agree that this is a national emergency. We can all agree that if there ever was a case for any kind of exceptionalism, be it via compulsory licensing or some other, middle of the road arrangement, the case for it is now. So I don't think in terms of what the Supreme Court or what the courts are likely to do, they very well understand that the case for exceptionalism exists. In fact, they've been trying to push the government in certain directions. The problem there, as I've already highlighted, is one of we all understand that there's a shortfall of vaccines. Now we can dither and plead different cases and causes for it, but the fact remains that there is an immense shortfall of vaccines, which does not seem like it's going to be fulfilled anytime soon. And each time statements have been made by the authorities with respect to when these requirements will be fulfilled, it's always been a sort of dilly-dallying response. It's always been changing timelines. And so there is that. There's a case for exceptionalism. There is obviously indeed a gross shortfall. And then there is the issue of transparency in terms of data. So courts are operating in that context, right? So whatever comes eventually in terms of a regulatory framework, I think the courts are going to, if if not stretch it out even further, they're going to back the proposal. This much is definitely the case. Let's establish that. Now, coming to that question, I think I'll again come back to, I would have loved to get Yogeshji's thoughts on Covaxin specifically, because we spoke to Remdesivir, and that's exactly the debate I did not want to enter, discussion I didn't want to enter. But in terms of Covaxin and compulsory licensing for Covaxin, firstly, whether it's required in light of the latest developments. But even if it was there, I wonder if the technology exists so that we can actually not have the discussions we have in the case of mRNA vaccines and other vaccines which are supposed to be technologically more novel, slightly more esoteric and exotic, where you will need, as Archana ma'am was saying, to also address, the allied issues of intellectual property, be it trade secrets, and that whole, we'll have to somehow get all the associations also along with us, and not just the intellectual properties that reside with one entity. So coming back to that, I think at the end of the day, and at the risk of being slightly oppositional and even caustic, I would just simply, this is more of a question, it's more of a thought. If we look at Covaxin, co-developed with ICMR, phasal testing requirements across the world have been truncated in many instances. This saves a lot of money also, obviously, but also signals all kinds of support by state authorities for the innovation of these vaccines. So I think when we speak of innovation, we also need to hedge it against what has already been subsidized or provided for by the state in terms of money, monetary support, or be it regulatory support in terms of truncating phasal requirements. So in light of that, certain vaccines like Covaxin, I guess compulsory licensing from an ethical point of view, from a market point of view, these considerations also have to come up. We can't simply sing paeans to innovation and generalities and say that, oh, look, there's innovation on one side and compulsory licensing on the other. The context in which research is occurring, the context in which approvals are being granted, obviously needs to be taken into account. And that has to obviously in some way factor into our analysis of whether on a simply ethical plane, compulsory licenses for certain of these, for instance, the Covaxin vaccine should be permitted. So that I think I would have loved to hear more of other people's thoughts on. Now, I just so we flagged issues of the state, and it's sort of easy to bash the state, especially when it's in the Supreme Court every day, and the Supreme Court is putting tough questions to it. But what about private players? Where are the PPPs? Where are the pandemic patent pools? Where is the COTAP? The technology access pools. All of this was being discussed 2 years ago, and it seems like none of it is coming through. And now, so at the end of the day, if there is going to be a collective effort in the context of a national emergency, in the context of a case for exceptionalism, then I think some of this responsibility is also distributed, and some of these discussions should also be had. What happened if the state was to act 6 months ago? Well, what about the consortium of states and companies trying to figure this out even before the first wave, or let's say in the case of vaccines, at least since December of last year? So none of that has come through. Again, compulsory licensing has to be seen in the context of what different players who are subject to these regimes, be it the state, be it these companies, what they have done, what is their prior conduct, what they are likely to do, and then these decisions have to be taken. And I'll just leave everyone with this, because actually this is something I just saw last night. I was watching one of these talks by Professor Fred Abbott, some lecture in Harvard Law School, where he speaks to the issues with compulsory license, so that I don't come across as a as a deadbeat supporter of compulsory licensing regimes. And he highlighted two problems, and I suppose that is what a lot of you have also been addressing. Firstly, the experience, in his opinion, of compulsory licensing regimes with respect to the Bayer and Bayer case that had happened, Natco and Bayer, was that it proved eventually to be very, very expensive, to be a long drawn out process, and really in his telling, he had spoken to someone at Natco, and he said that wasn't a great experience for Natco either. So firstly, he said there are problems of inefficiency and scale, and obviously costs associated with it, and obviously the temporal nature of how these things play out. So we might be a little late in the day when it comes to compulsory licensing, if our goal is to provide vaccinations over the next 1 year or so. So that problem will persist. And the second is, and I love the way he framed this, he said, the problem is one of political economy as well. where if we supposing go beyond Covaxin, go to one of these foreign companies and we say, okay, we are going to enforce, Section 92 regulatory procedure, we're going to kick in and we're going to take all these for whatever reason. Let's set aside the technological problems. What you're likely to get in his words, and I found them very interesting, is probably the Ministry of Finance is going to walk into that office and say, what are you trying to do? Because there are going to be various repercussions at various other levels, and he gives the example of Colombia, which some time ago had pushed for compulsory licenses in certain pharmaceutical areas and had basically faced pushback for its entry into the OECD, just to give one example of it, right? The web of diplomacy and how this plays out. So I guess those are the risks you run when you're talking about compulsory licensing or any of these waivers, intellectual property waivers, at a scale larger than or outside of the example of something that's indigenously developed. And therefore, to get over those problems, maybe as a test case, we take Covaxin. Of course, the problem with that test case is you can't extrapolate easily because with Covaxin, there is anyway so much government control, so much leverage that the government has that it can actually not look at compulsory licensing and look at other frameworks of voluntary mechanisms for licensing.
Thanks,
so I'll just
Manu.
leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel so bad that then I have to interrupt.
No, I'm sorry. It's just that a practicing lawyer will go on and on. So thank you for shutting me up.
Actually, the only issue is that clock is right in front of me. And I know we have just someone left, and allow IPTSE Academy to maybe touch base with you in solo, like 30 minutes interview just with you, just so that, everyone gets benefited. Aman will be the final remarks. 30 seconds, if it is okay, and then you give it to Ria to close.
Given that I am not a practicing lawyer, I'll not take that much time. So my simplest submission is that there is definitely no magic bullet. There is no magic pill that will solve our problems. Provisions of compulsory licensing are not a quick remedy, as we have seen in the case of baricitinib. The voluntary licensing was a much faster and efficient process. As Professor Pandit has rightly pointed out, the TRIPS waiver is also like a means to an end. It is that India is leading an initiative on behalf of the entire world, and we must appreciate it. Again, the contrary stance that we have between two arms of the government, it is debatable. With respect to Covaxin, the problem, Manu, is that, first of all, I don't think it is covered by a patent because I don't see any patent family of that. Secondly, the whole viron-based vaccines are much more difficult to produce, and they require these BSL-3 facilities, which are not in so much, not available so much. And even preparing the, giving training to the people to handle live viruses, it needs a lot of time. I think this has been pointed out excellently by the, I think, the former director of the one of the CSI laboratories. On that note, my final point will be that early stage innovations by universities and scientific and industrial research organizations need to be improved in India. Statistics often, as in practice you would have heard, they hide the vital details. Like in the statistics of the patent office, IITs are having the most number of patents every year, but they are represented collectively. Statistics reveal that CSIR files the highest number of patents, but it is 39 laboratories collectively are represented. We need to ensure that our institutions are encouraged to research. The early stage innovations come out of them, so that we are not dependent on the Jenner Institute to have a viable global vaccine. The next one should come out of India. My very last statement will be that I'm just going to quote Granville Austin, given that we are into the Constitution. The promise of a better tomorrow must be fulfilled today, because day after tomorrow, it runs the risk of being conveniently forgotten.
Yeah, very well, sir. I think it's a good summary. I would say you made my work easy. And thank you so much, everyone. And I'll just quickly give it to Ria for closing the session. I know she wants to thank you all. They are all very excited. Ria, over to you. You can put your video on, I guess.
Just one second. So I would like to extend a very heartfelt gratitude to all our panelists for their informative insights on this very crucial subject. Also, I would like to thank Dr. G.N. Darvekar, who is the principal of Acropolis Institute of Pharmaceutical Education and Research, And we would also like to thank Rakhi Kavya, who is the assistant professor from AIPER, for supporting today's webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.